Now we're going to go over just a short history of utilitarianism. Now, if you look here, utilitarianism gets its start with Epicurus, who was an ancient Greek philosopher. And then we go to Hutcheson, David Hume, and the two main utilitarians are John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. But even among those two, when people typically talk about utilitarianism today, they are typically referring to the philosophy of John Stuart Mill. Now, with Epicurus, we have this statement here. Pleasure is the goal that nature has ordained for us. It is also the standard by which we judge everything good. Pleasure. Pleasure is the standard by which we judge everything good. So if something's good or evil or good or bad, it's based on pleasure and pain. If something is pleasurable, it's good. If something is painful, it's bad. So if I break my, if I do some act and I break and it causes me to break my leg or something like that, that's bad, pain. If something gives me pleasure, like eating ice cream, then that's good. It's pretty simple. I mean, his philosophy, I mean, this is not too complicated. I mean, this is pretty simple. I mean, good is pleasure, bad is pain. And then we move on from Epicurus to Hutcheson. Now, the reason why we started with Epicurus is because as we go through these philosophers, we must remember the basis. We must remember the starting point. Okay, because the starting point, people tend to forget it. But a good thinker, a good philosopher will always take heed. They will always be aware of the basis, the underlying philosophy. So Hutcheson says, that action is best which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. Now, we just went over Epicurus, and now Hutcheson. Hutcheson is saying, the action is best which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. Utilitarianism is about the greatest amount of good for the greatest numbers. In other words, it's about looking at morality, making a moral statements of what we ought to do and what ought not to do based on the greatest good or the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And we really see that here with Hutcheson. But keep in mind, if we weren't aware of that previous statement from Epicurus, we could start to get lost here. Because Hutcheson says the greatest happiness. Now, the reason why we mention Epicurus is because that's the foundation for this. That's what Hutcheson is going to be building on. Because even a philosopher like Aristotle uses the word happiness, but he's not talking about the happiness that Hutcheson is talking about. And Hutcheson is not talking about, rather Hutcheson came after Aristotle, so Hutcheson isn't talking about the happiness that Aristotle was talking about. What does he mean by happiness, Hutcheson? It's related to pain and pleasure. Because we just said Epicurus is the foundation. Epicurus is the starting point for utilitarianism. Now the philosopher David Hume adds on to what was previously stated. He adds on by introducing this idea of utility or usefulness. He says, and as every quality which is useful or agreeable to ourselves or others is in common life allowed to be a part of personal merit. So here you have this idea of usefulness being part of personal merit. In other words, he's basically saying what virtue is something, what the right act is something that's useful. So after Hume introduces this word utility, okay, because that's the basis of utilitarianism. So what is utility based on all the thinkers that we talked about before David Hume? What do you think it's related to at this point? It's related to pain and pleasure. We can't forget the basis for this because there's always words that are going to be thrown on top of other words. And so we have to realize what the basis and the foundations of some of these ideas are. So now we have Jeremy Bentham. He says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as what we shall do. Sounds pretty similar to Epicurus, right? Pain and pleasure. And so we have here the consequentialist principle and the utility principle based on Jeremy Bentham. And these are from the philosopher Louis Poyman, how he sets these principles out. The consequentialist principle, the rightness or wrongness of an act is determined by the goodness or badness of the results that follow from it. Okay, in other words, the consequence. The rightness or wrongness of an act is based on the goodness or badness of the results that follow from it. Now, if you're getting a little bit confused here, you shouldn't be, because what does he mean by goodness and badness? What do you think is meant here? Pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure is the goodness and badness. That can never be you can't forget that. And then the utility principle. The only thing that is good in itself is some specific type of state. Some specific type of state. That's the only. What do you think he's talking about? Like the United States of America? No, he's talking about like a state of being. Like you're in a state of pleasure or you're in a state of pain. That's the only thing that is good in itself. That's what Bentham is claiming. The only thing good in itself is some specific type of state, right? Not the end goal of your life or some other lofty goal that you have, some idea in your mind. It is this state of pleasure or this state of pain. Obviously, they're not saying that pain is good in itself. That would be bad in itself. But this is the contribution of Bentham. And then we get to the ultimate utilitarian. Oh, first of all, we forgot to, let me say this. Bentham was criticized at the time and still to this day. I mean, I just not too long ago, I heard some judge giving a speech where they were kind of making fun of the hedonic calculus that Bentham gives, which we'll go over in a second. But Bentham is known for the pig philosophy because just like Epicurus, he is claiming that the highest goal in life, what's good in itself, is pleasure. And what's bad is pain. Okay, so the pig philosophy would state that it's better to be a pig satisfied than Socrates dissatisfied. Why would this be the pig philosophy? Because anybody who holds it, they are holding out the pig as greater than Socrates. Now, most people look up to Socrates. A lot of people, Socrates throughout the years has been a symbol of what human beings could be, concerning, especially for those who are truth seekers. But according to Bentham's philosophy, the pig is better. The pig has contributed, maybe has contributed more. Because what does the pig do? The pig is just out for pleasure. But according to Bentham, that's the highest thing in your life, is going after pleasure. So it's better to be this pig than Socrates, which most people can see is absurd. Not just for Socrates, not just according to Bentham's, the pig, apparently, that person who acts like a pig is more worthy of honor than even some of our other thinkers that we have that maybe suffered for what they believed. So John Stuart Mill is going to try to correct this. by making a distinction between lower order pleasures and higher order pleasures. The lower order pleasures are what you probably think they are: eating, drinking, sex, sleeping. Those are just physical pleasure. But then Mill says there's higher order pleasures. Now, the reason why Mill is trying to save this thinking, this utilitarianism, is because he agrees with it. He agrees with a lot of the things that these people are saying. And so he wants to try to help out here. And so that's why he's making this distinction: lower order and higher order. What's a higher order pleasure? The satisfaction that you get from listening to classical music. The satisfaction you would get from graduating college. The satisfaction you would get from finishing a really good book. That's higher. That's a higher type. There's some pleasure there, but it's a higher type of pleasure than just eating ice cream. Right. So the main problem with all of this is that is ultimately based on pleasure, and pleasure is subjective. So therefore, pleasure provides a very weak basis for establishing moral rules, because moral rules are supposed to be objective and for everybody. And if they're not for everybody, if there's no commonality among the moral rules, then it is a weak basis. And so pleasure, I mean, just think about it. I mean, do you find the things you find pleasurable, does your friends find the same thing pleasurable? Like, you might have some commonality there, right? But not in everything. Person A, listening to Mozart gives people pleasure. So if some person says that, so let's say some person likes classical music and they say listening to Mozart gives people pleasure. And then they go on and say everybody should listen to Mozart as a moral statement. And then person B says listening to Mozart does not give people pleasure. So therefore people should not listen to Mozart. Now, if two people were to say something like that, what basis would John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham or Epicurus or any of these have for saying that one of these are false? What would be their basis for saying one of these are false? So if somebody says, because Mill was trying to claim this, that there's some higher order pleasures that people ought to find pleasure in. But if somebody doesn't, how can you condemn them for that? Like, if somebody doesn't like, so for some people, they don't like listening to classical music. It annoys them. Classical music hasn't been around forever. When it started, I mean, it annoyed people. And still to this day it does. Some people just don't like to listen to it. But how would John Stuart Mill reply to that? What would be his standard? This is the whole point. He would have to rely on some further standard in order to condemn such a statement. So if somebody said listening to Mozart does not give people pleasure, so people should not listen to Mozart, the only way John Stuart Mill can say that is false is by appealing to some other standard other than pain and pleasure. You know why? Because pleasure is subjective. It's personal. It is hard to condemn the pleasure that somebody gets out of something. So if somebody gets pleasure out of doing a workout, like a hard workout, like lifting weights, and there's pain in there, but it just happens. People get pleasure out of working out. And who can condemn that? Who can say, no, you're wrong, you're not feeling pleasure right now? This is false. Like, it doesn't even make any sense, because pleasure is subjective. And pleasure usually accompanies a real action, some action. Pleasure usually accompanies or follows some sort of action that you're doing. And pleasure is ultimately subjective. So that's why it just does not provide a very strong foundation for morality.